On today's World Insight, global efforts to curb nuclear weapons hit snags in the Korean Peninsula and the Middle East. What would it take to get negotiations going on the Iran nuclear deal and the DPRK's weapon program? And a turbulent world on the edge of the abyss. The dire warning from the UN Secretary General as world leaders gather at the UN General Assembly. Can nations help heal divisions and work together to save the day? That's up for discussion with an international development scholar.
The world needs something new, especially after being so shaken in the past 2 years by the pandemic.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Iran said on Tuesday that talks with world powers over reviving the 2015 nuclear deal would resume in a few weeks. This after Iran agreed to renew UN nuclear inspections. Meanwhile, on the Korean Peninsula, envoys from Japan, the United States, and South Korea are keen on denuclearization efforts following the DPRK's recent string of missile tests. Recently, at the last stop of Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi's Asia tour, he and South Korean President Moon Jae-in did agree to double down on denuclearization efforts. So, what's the prospect of curbing nuclear arms race? Let's bring in our panelists. For the latest on IAEA meetings and global denuclearization in Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, professor of history at American University. Also, Toby Daunton, co-director and senior fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program with Carnegie Endowment. In Beijing, Zhao Tong, senior fellow, Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. The IAEA meetings are still underway, but there are a lot on the agenda. First of all, how do you see the latest apparent achievement between IAEA and Iran about a further look into the country's nuclear program? Mr. Dalton.
I think it's really important that Iran continues to cooperate with the IAEA to allow access to monitor its nuclear facilities. Obviously, there's lots of problems with the Iran nuclear deal signed with 6 other negotiating powers, and the IAEA is the key implementing agency for inspections in Iran. So I think this is an important temporary measure, but it doesn't fundamentally address the concerns, the problems that are hampering a resumption of the deal.
Professor Kuznick.
Well, I certainly agree with Toby about that. This is a serious problem internationally. We had a chance to negotiate with a much friendlier regime, but the new regime in power now is more of a hard line, and they're going to be a little bit more difficult to negotiate with. Unfortunately, the United States abrogated the JCPOA back in 2018, which puts the United States in the position of needing to deliver. And the United States, in my opinion, has got to take the initiative and even make some compromises where it might not want to. But Biden is going to be under pressure from the Republicans, as well as from some hawks within the Democratic Party, to not give many concessions to the Iranians, and that's going to make negotiating difficult.
Mr. Dalton, of course, we haven't seen much actions on international policy besides the Biden administration's policy toward China or about China. Do you expect more real policies and actions from this administration on Iran?
Well, just to highlight one thing that is often overlooked, which is that in the very first days of this administration, they very quickly put in place an extension of the New START arms control treaty with Russia. has long been forgotten because it happened, eons ago in Washington time. And yet that was a really key measure that allowed for the continuation of cooperation there. But apart from Iran, I think the constraints faced by the Biden administration here in Washington are manifest and really hamper its ability to focus on many foreign policy issues, let alone key nuclear policy issues beyond Iran, such as North Korea or others.
Mr. Zhao, tell me more about your assessment on the Iran IAEA issue.
As Mr. Dalton just said, the plate was very full for Mr. Biden, so it took some time before some really effective communications and meetings took place between US and Iran. So we didn't have a deal before the previous Iranian administration went out of power. And then there is this silent period in the summer, but with a new and more conservative and hawkish administration in power today, it will also take more time before even starting substantive engagement. I think that delay is really making some Chinese experts nervous, and they worry that the prospect of a swift and effective resumption of JCPOA is becoming doomer today.
How do you see that with the latest agreement of IAEA and Iran? Without JCPOA, how do you see the prospect, Mr. Zhao?
I think as Mr. Dalton also implied, it was a technical and temporary solution, trying to keep the monitoring at key Iranian sites working, but we still need much greater political commitment from our sides in order to have this JCPOA negotiation restarted as soon as possible.
Do you see China's commitment?
Well, I think China is very committed. China's position has long been that the U.S. withdrew from the deal unilaterally. So it's better that if Washington can take a more flexible approach and to demonstrate its willingness. And then it also requires the new Iranian administration to be very cooperative. I think we heard in recent days that Russia putting a little more pressure on Iran, hoping it to stick to its positions prior to the suspension of talks in late spring. I think China also can contribute a little more by also nudging the Iranian government slightly to the direction so that we can move things forward.
What about the other hotspot issues, DPRK, denuclearization? In fact, we don't call it DPRK denuclearization, but rather the Korean Peninsula denuclearization, because it does not is something only takes DPRK's effort. So go to you, Mr. Dalton, about that. Recently, some interesting movement.
Well, I think there's not been a lot of movement. In fact, if anything, the indications from the Korean Peninsula are in the other direction, with missile testing by both North Korea and South Korea in recent weeks. And the display of new capabilities suggests, in fact, that there's an arms race that is on, which makes the denuclearization prospects even harder to achieve. As far as the Biden administration is concerned, I think they've put out a statement that says that their policy is for a practical and calibrated approach to this issue. Yet we do not see a lot of impetus behind it, apart from offers that the U.S. is willing to talk anytime, anywhere without precondition. That's not what North Korea is looking for. Frankly, I think that's not what is needed at this moment to actually open a new window for diplomacy.
Very interesting. The North and South Korea developments almost all at the same time while the geopolitics are changing in the region, Mr. Zhao.
Yes, indeed. We are seeing a new wave of inter-Korean arms race with both countries testing all sorts of missile systems, including very capable ones like submarine-launched ballistic missiles and even train-based ballistic missiles from North Korea. And there is, we need to put a handle onto this and contain this very dangerous trend from further escalating. I think that requires all the major powers in the region being on the same page. I think China, US, South Korea can certainly have a new round of discussions. And that is also useful for achieving the eventual role of a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula, because we need to build a new peace regime.
Okay.
So how to construct a new regional security structure is part of that big picture question.
Professor Kosnik, unfortunately, I have to put that question forward to you once again, that is the United States have the willingness, the determination, and the capability and the time to deal with the DPRK nuclear issue as well?
Well, it might not have the time and the focus. You have to remember that first Biden was consumed with the withdrawal from Afghanistan in recent weeks. And there are a lot of things going on in the United States politically. The COVID problem, the killing of the civilians by mistake in Afghanistan. There's a lot of political issues on Biden's plate right now, but North Korea is an important problem. And the North Koreans seem to be expanding right now. They're in a somewhat aggressive mode again. They seem to be increasing the amount of fissile material. They seem to be possibly expanding the number of centrifuges. They already have a big stockpile. And if that is growing, then that is a serious concern. The more the United States delays on both Iran and North Korea, the more difficult both of those issues become. So I think we need to see some quick action on the part of the United States, but the United States is limited to what it can do with North Korea. If North Korea refuses to talk to the United States again is going to need to turn to Russia and China to try to convince the North Koreans to come back to the negotiating table.
Okay. How do you see that, Mr. Dalton, the urgency and now the interesting geopolitics that might be hindering the earlier kinds of cooperation?
Well, I think it's a really key point that Jia Tong raised about the need for cooperation to look beyond just specifically the denuclearization issue to the broader peace regime that's required on the Korean Peninsula. I think we could all agree that avoiding a war on the Korean Peninsula is something that we should all work for. And yet, when it comes to a vision for what the future of the Korean Peninsula should look like, I think that we see divergent interests. And so that makes diplomacy to even get into a new negotiation with North Korea that much harder. Yet, as Professor Kosnik said, the urgency is becoming more clear, one warhead at a time, frankly.
Mr. Dalton, the point of our discussion is not to criticize the United States. One of the things people ask is whether the U.S. is willing to work with South Korea to end a war and officially announce that. That's what the peace regime, a key point of it. Now, how much willingness, determination, capability, time, and political will is there to do that?
I think, honestly, there's not a lot of political will. And indeed, I'm quite concerned that given the geopolitics, the opportunities to even exercise what will there is are narrowing. And that's not just because of US-China considerations, but also what's happening between the two Koreas with the arms race that we see. South Korea faces an election to elect a new president in a little over 6 months. Who knows how that will turn out? Obviously, the administration of President Moon had made a significant effort in 2017-18 to initiate the new peace process. That didn't pan out. And so I think that it's going to take a little while again before there's a new opportunity to work on the peace regime. That's not the fault of the United States. It's not the fault of South Korea or other states. I think it's just the international circumstances as
the
North Korea has been
circumstances earlier with the Trump administration is to not necessarily do much and fail to reach any result during the two peace so-called negotiations, both in Singapore and in Vietnam. I'm afraid it's not just a situation that nobody should take responsible for. There is parties of responsibility.
Well, look, I think that there's blame to be shared for that. I think that the Trump administration tried to do certain things, but it was also not able to follow it through because of internal disagreements about what should be done. I think it's also clear that North Korea was not willing to go as far as they purported to go in terms of offering steps for denuclearization. So it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a missed opportunity and an unfortunate one. And that now the situation is such that, again, not through the fault of specific parties, but because of international circumstances, the diplomacy is just going to be that much harder.
I see. Professor Kosnick.
We have to look compared to the situation we confronted back in 2017, when the head of the Council on Foreign Relations said he thought there was a 50-50 chance that we were going to go to war with North Korea. The situation we're in now is certainly better. We lost ground under Trump when he and Kim were writing love letters. It could have been doing something a little bit more serious at that point, but we have very, very different visions. The North Koreans are not about to give up their nuclear weapons. I think the United States has to recognize that. We need to, I hope we can freeze those nuclear weapons and we can use that as a basis for building a little bit of trust. We haven't even ended the Korean War yet. And how many years has that been? So there's a lot of things that we need to do to build up trust between the United States, South Korea, and North Korea. And again, I think that if we can improve relations between the United States and China, then that can go a long way toward helping create an environment which that becomes possible.
Mr. Zhao, is that the key?
I don't think it matters. For China to invest its fiscal capital into resolving North Korean issue requires a better U.S.-China relationship and the China-South Korea relationship. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi just visited South Korea. I think one of the important concerns of China is whether South Korea is going to forge a closer security alliance relationship with the United States, or even to join the US-led Quad Plus security regime, which is viewed by Beijing as being anti-China. If South Korea and the US can show greater interest in stabilizing their relations with China, I think that will certainly help China be more willing to contain North Korea's nuclear provocations, missile provocations. One, I think, important future opportunity is for Beijing to use the Winter Olympics to host, important officials from these countries, so they would have an opportunity to jumpstart the diplomatic process. I think that to make that successful would require support from US, South Korea, and other countries.
Of course, this is also the decision of the IOC, one of the very key figures if we talk about the Winter Olympic Games, Mr. Zhao. I'm sure you're aware of that. Having said that, though, let me also ask all of you. Chinese President Xi Jinping, during his speech at the General Assembly of the United Nations, he talked about three key areas: security, development, and also human rights. He also asked statesmen and leaders around the world to be able to answer those so-called centennial key questions. How do you see today we should learn from the earlier mistakes?
When I think of statesmanship in that regard, I think of the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Kennedy and Khrushchev, they worked together to try to do, as Khrushchev said in a letter to Kennedy, that let's eliminate every conflict between us that could lead to a new crisis. We need that kind of leadership, that kind of vision. Unfortunately, Kennedy was assassinated and Khrushchev was toppled, but they had that vision. And there have been very few times when the world's leaders have had that kind of vision. What we see is the United States viewing China increasingly not just as a competitor, but as an adversary, almost an enemy, and building up alliances. This deal with Australia and Britain, I think, is exactly the wrong kind of thing. And that not only in terms of the alliances with Europe, but also in terms of the potential for nuclear proliferation. We're talking about nuclear submarines that very likely will use nuclear fuel that's going to be enriched to 94%. The potential for proliferation in that regard and the precedents that that sets. What if Pakistan or Iran wants China to help them develop nuclear subs? Now there's a loophole that they can all drive through. So I think we're not approaching it in the way we need to. I think the Biden administration needs to take a step back, and we need to find the common grounds between us and China that we can work on together to build an environment of much more trust than exists right now.
I see.
Well, specifically on leadership and echoing what Professor Kuznick said, finding opportunities like Reagan and Gorbachev did, where they could align their visions and take risks, both of them political risks, with their domestic audiences to advance and push their governments into these arrangements that ultimately ended the Cold War. I think the same kind of risk-taking with domestic politics is necessary not only in the United States, but in China and Russia and other countries too. The challenge that we face is that all of our countries are going through nationalist moments right now, where that kind of risk-taking, the demonstration of leadership, the willingness to extend a hand of cooperation to other countries is criticized domestically as being weak or playing into the hands of enemies or things like that. So it's a very difficult moment, but it is an absolutely necessary thing that has to happen. On the submarine agreement, I agree. The precedent, I think, is really unhelpful and unfortunate from a non-proliferation standpoint. And yet, I think that you see a lot of support for that agreement in countries in East Asia, in Korea and Japan and India. So it's a very complex system, I think, that we're seeing evolve there. But I agree that the precedent of supplying nuclear reactor technology for naval propulsion is an unfortunate one, and could be something that Iran, for instance, uses as a pretext for enhancing its enrichment of uranium that could ultimately be used for nuclear weapons.
I think the greatest concern is it shows the major powers, US, UK, Australia, they are willing to prioritize great power competition over global non-proliferation principles. And that shows that we do need top-level political commitment to manage these trends. Recently, we see US and Russian presidents jointly repeating the Reagan-Gorbachev statements of nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. I think the proposal to have a P5 heads of states summit would make sense because it would create opportunity for all the top leaderships from these great powers to sit together and sort through all these important high politics issues.
All right, Zhao Tong, Toby Dalton, and Peter Kuznick. What a pleasure. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. And you're watching World Insight. Coming up, a turbulent world on the verge of abyss. The dire warning from the UN Secretary General as world leaders gather at the UN General Assembly. Can nations help heal divisions and work together to save the day? That's up for discussion with an international development scholar.
The world needs something new, especially after being so shaken in the past 2 years by the pandemic.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Heads of state and government began to address on Tuesday the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, or the UNGA. Climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, and security issues have so far taken center stage at the annual gathering. U.S. President Joe Biden delivered his debut address amid strong doubts about his ability to bring the U.S. back to the position of global leadership, pledging to work toward a, quote, peaceful, prosperous future for all, end of quote. Biden has taken a reassuring tone amid global turbulence and transformation. Could words match deeds so multilateralism can work? What can the UN do to double down on multilateralism? Could the US play well with others? For answers, I talked to Jeffrey Sachs, professor at Columbia University and former special advisor to the UN Secretary General. Let's listen to his thoughts. And now in New York, I'm joined by Jeffrey Sachs, a professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Professor Sachs, always a pleasure. What a pleasure to see you once again.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
People have been talking about this week is the UN General Assembly meeting. And now various state leaders are delivering their messages to the world. Professor, I understand the Chinese president have been calling on 3 key points, that is security, development, and human rights. He said that would be the priority, should be the priority for the world. Your take?
He said that we have to end the pandemic. He talked about China devoting many vaccines for the world. He talked about a new initiative of development. So I'm very much looking forward to speaking with the Chinese officials about all of the follow-up, because I think this is very promising. The world needs something new, especially after being so shaken in the past 2 years by the pandemic. How we need cooperation for recovery, how we need new financing for a green and digital way forward. So in this sense, there actually was a lot of common vision, but a lot of shaken people also.
Professor Sachs, if you are being asked to prioritize what needs to be done at the leaders level of countries, what would you say?
First, peace and cooperation and dialogue, and avoid arms races so that we really can devote our resources to human well-being. This is the most important point. Cooperate. Use the UN Charter. This is the crucial point. Then second, achieve the goals that we have set, the Paris Agreement on Climate and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Then third, plan sensibly. In other words, a rational approach says, once you have goals, then define the path to achieving those goals transparently and clearly. And the fourth is help to finance those goals, because for the poorest countries, they cannot finance the human needs out of their own meager resources. Right. So either people are left to massive suffering, and we have promised, no, we're not going to do that. It's too cruel, too dangerous, too destabilizing. But then we need a serious approach on financing so that those who have can help those who do not have. And this is extremely important.
If you were being asked by your president to be an advisor about some still very challenging years ahead, in which there's going to be the midterm election, there's of course going to be the presidential election, there's party divide, there's society divisions. What would you suggest?
Well, I give advice even without being asked, because I write a lot of news columns, I write a lot of articles, so I give my advice. My advice is, first, cooperate with China, because we absolutely do not need tensions, arms races. We have to work together. I offer that advice every day. Second, think practically. And think operationally. So we need to get vaccines to people. We need to sit down, US and Chinese and Russian, European Union, Indian, UK, the companies and officials of government to work out an allocation strategy, very organized, very cooperative. And my third point is the UN can do a lot for all countries, for all governments, because the UN as an institution has on the ground presence all over the world, and it's respected. It's understood to be a legitimate presence. It's a presence because the countries want that presence. And so help the UN to deliver the support, especially for the poorer countries. But one of the funny things that's happened is that even with the vaccine needs, the UN has not been able to get the vaccines because the companies are making private deals, or the rich countries are taking the vaccines up first. So my advice to the US is stop trying to do everything, because obviously we're under such stress, but turn responsibilities over to the UN and cooperate globally. Stop wasting our time on conflict.
Professor Sachs, though, I have to ask you directly, can you do that, some of the things you just mentioned? On the one hand, contributing all these responsibilities to the United Nations, but on the other hand, do not regard the United Nations as relevant anymore, and do things not necessarily based on the UN Charter. Can you do that? In other words, you only give out the responsibilities and leave to yourself all things that you think you can hold on to for your best interest. Is that the way to do things? Do you think others would buy that?
Well, this has been my complaint about U.S. foreign policy for quite a long time. And I wrote a book in 2019 called A New Foreign Policy Beyond American Exceptionalism, because I said we can't proceed on the grounds that the U.S. can do what it wants, call the shots, cooperate when it wants, not cooperate when it wants. Interestingly, I like President Biden on so many things, and he's trying to move our domestic agenda against really very reactionary opposition. But there is a mindset, even in this administration, so many times at the UN, President Biden said, allies and partners, allies and partners, allies and partners. And what he means is very much an us versus them way of thinking. It was all about allies and partners. Now, that's better than America first or America alone. It's a step in a better direction, but it's not quite multilateralism in the right way yet, because it's still drawing lines. You're on the other side, we're on this side, we're good, you're not. And this is absolutely a wrong way to say things. President Biden was saying, we will lead. And then he said the next sentence, we've been at war for 20 years. I wish there was some reflection on that fact. The United States has been in really stupid, misguided, destructive wars for 20 years. And that should cause some self-reflection rather than saying, okay, the war's over, now we lead. It's not the right way. The wars are over, and now we think. And now we act with some little bit of forbearance, a little bit of more mutual respect would do a lot of good.
Now we see the issue of Afghanistan. It's also a hot topic on the UN General Assembly this week. Professor Sachs, after being in Afghanistan for 20 years, with very different agenda, do you see what is the role should be of the United States?
The role, I think, for all of the governments other than Afghanistan is through the UN, and specifically in this case, through the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council should take responsibility and in a way assign responsibility also to the UN agencies and systems to help on this. But in the Security Council, we have the US, China, Russia, very important. All three are important to finding some way forward that doesn't lead to collapse. The United States has impounded Afghanistan's foreign exchange reserves. That is contributing to a massive banking crisis right now. It will lead to an economic implosion unless there is an economic and financial strategy. And the United States, though, is, obviously it's out, thank God. and it's not capable of solving this problem on its own. But it also can't just sit on Afghanistan's foreign exchange reserves as if that doesn't mean something very practical, because it's it causes an economic implosion. So what's the way out for the U.S.? Multilateralize this so that there is some shared sense of responsibility for how to move forward, and that it's possible actually to design something realistic and not just sit there as now every economic institution implodes, and that could lead to both humanitarian crisis and more violence and the kind of disaster we don't want to happen.
Professor Sachs, I'm sure you're aware of what President Biden said to his domestic audience. I'm sure he assumed that the U.S. was not in Afghanistan for rebuilding. U.S. was not in Afghanistan for other reasons, but rather only U.S. was in Afghanistan for the security of the United States, that terrorism will not happen on the land of the United States. Now, that, of course, went contradictory to some of the earlier statements both him and other American leaders made at various occasions throughout the past 20 years. But the question really is, the U.S. politics changes. Is it fair to ask the world to consider all the commitments made by Washington change every 4 years or even fewer than that? If that is the case, what does that mean for U.S. commitment, and even more importantly, the U.S. credibility?
The problem in the U.S. right now is that our society is really deeply divided, or maybe the society isn't quite as divided as the political system. We have a political divide between two parties right down the middle that is paralyzing, and it's very antagonistic, completely almost nihilistic. The Republican Party, especially with Trump's influence, is extremely destructive to the U.S. well-being, by the way, internally. But it means no government really can speak for America right now, because President Biden struggles to get any vote through Congress. He can't pass legislation. Everything is up for grabs. The Republicans are trying to do everything to destroy the administration in order to win one or two houses of Congress in the November 2022 election.
Right.
And if they do that, they paralyze the government for the next 2 years, because they're hoping that by wrecking the U.S. for 2 more years, they would somehow come to power in 2024. It's an extraordinarily cynical, dangerous, destructive approach, but that's what's happening in America right now. So it's very hard for America to have a consistent policy on anything. You know, the president says, I speak for America, but America is so politically divided that he turns around the next moment to look domestically, and he's struggling to pass any legislation.
But one issue has to be clear, that one could be sympathetic and empathetic. However, the U.S., if not acting rightly on some of the key issues, those issues will come back and haunt the United States once again in the future. You see that in many occasions: Afghanistan, terrorism, Taliban, and Al-Qaeda, the list goes on. So Professor Sachs, now another thing is about what is going to be the U.S. vision regarding China-U.S. relations. Everybody knows this is going to be one of the most crucial bilateral relations. And your president also talked to my president on the phone recently. But we haven't seen relations and policies change. But only right after that, something called AUKUS was being created, which is an alliance apparently between the U.S., Australia, and the United Kingdom. So Professor, how should we read all of these messages regarding whether the U.S. has learned the lessons, regarding whether the U.S., even not being responsible for everything in the world, but at least responsible for its own act and its own future?
Well, the sad truth is that the U.S. Political scene is fiercely in division on almost everything except China. There is a very uncomfortable, nasty, ill-informed, bipartisan anti-China sentiment right now. Now, it's stupid because I know these people don't know anything about the U.S.-China scene, by the way. Most of these people have never been to China. I don't know if they have a passport. They know nothing. But this has become quickly a kind of political talking point of both parties. It's really unpleasant. And I find it mind-boggling, actually, how quickly this view has come. My belief is that if China is very calm, careful, determined to promote multilateralism, development, the UN system, cooperation, that will work. I think that what I worry about, of course, is given the intemperate attitudes of the U.S., which I think are provocative. I'm absolutely against this new nuclear submarine deal with Australia, because why should we have an arms race right now? It makes no sense given our needs. But I hope that it just doesn't lead to provocation, escalation, because the world will get very dangerous. And right now, the U.S. is provoking. The U.S. is antagonistic. The U.S. in a bipartisan way is doing this, not in any thoughtful manner, in my opinion. I say this every day inside the United States. I find it dangerous, but I hope that very calm heads will prevail in other parts of the world and recognize this is not what we want. The Secretary General was very clear on this point today also. We do not want a Cold War. We do not want confrontation between the two big powers. It makes no sense for the world at all, and there's no cause for it whatsoever.
Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, always a pleasure. And thank you for being a responsible global citizen, Professor Sachs.
Good to be with you. Thanks so much.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.